Now we have our third presenter, Nate Post with HuLa.
Hi, I'm Nate Post, one of the founders at HuLa. Did you know that of all the money raised for cancer research that actually makes it into the labs, half is being wasted unintentionally? Half. And what's worse, that problem is adding years to finding a cure. Years that patients today simply don't have. And it's for that reason that we built HuLa. But before we get there, it's important to understand a little bit about how the research industry actually works. So whether we're talking about developing a new cancer therapy or an advanced semiconductor, the school of thought has always been, as long as we have money coming in, good things will come out. But we've never actually looked under the hood. What's actually happening inside of the lab? I'll tell you a quick story. For a little over 3 years, I built and managed one of these research firms surrounded by some incredibly intelligent people. And well, about this time last year, Josh managed to waste 2 weeks and a little more than $30,000 trying to solve a problem that had been figured out 6 months before by a guy he literally shares a desk with. That's Evan. So my first reaction is, we must be doing something wrong, right? So I start calling my counterparts at other research firms, hoping to get some answers, but instead was told, sorry, that's just a cost of doing business. Well, it turns out the problem we were having wasn't an anomaly, and of the $248 billion spent on fundamental research science, half is wasted on repeating known failures and resolving solved problems. And what's worse, most of this is happening within research teams, exactly the problem we were having. So the obvious next question is, why in the world is this happening, right? So here it's important to understand two key concepts about how scientists actually work. The first is, while scientists definitely work in teams, they're individually running experiments and thus individually keeping track of those results, right? So in this case, when Evan figured out that chemical A and chemical B was a problem, well, it was great for Evan. It did nothing for Josh. And the second is that every activity in a research lab is supporting what's called process development. Basically, how do we go from an idea to a reliable technology, right? And well, along that path, a scientist is faced with thousands of variables and hundreds of possible paths forward at each juncture in the development process. Today, we're requiring scientists to keep track of every micro result, chemical reaction, material incompatibility that they or any of their colleagues have ever witnessed, and then somehow derive some value in what they're working on today. The point is, it doesn't happen. And we're forcing them to resort to little more than educated poking in the dark. The biggest irony in this situation is that science, time and again, has shown that the human brain is terrible at memory and recall. We're great at making decisions once we have information, but we are terrible at keeping track of stuff, let alone keeping track of everybody else's work. That is until now. HuLa is the first smart process development platform that does the memory and recall for you. We're capturing all of the information produced by a lab and translating into relevant contextual insights in line with what the individual is doing, all done automatically. So now, instead of poking in the dark, these scientists are making data-driven decisions. What that means is we're able to cut the costs and time it takes to develop a new technology in half. And this is in an industry with an average development cycle of 3 to 5 years. And if you're talking pharmaceuticals, as much as $500 million. Let me show you how we're doing this. So you remember my friend Josh? Well, without getting too technical, the problem he was running into, he's working on a 27-step process, and in the final bake step, he was having one of his chemicalators fully peel off, and he just couldn't figure out why. Well, if he and Evan had been using HuLa during this process, instead of beating his head against the wall for 2 weeks, in about 30 seconds, he would have known the problem was back up in step number 2, where he was spinning the material on too fast, which meant that the layer was going to be too thin, which meant it was going to fail in the final step. What HuLa's doing here is understanding the context that Josh is working in, and then pulling this micro result that Evan figured out 6 months before. Kind of cool, right? The second key piece here is once we figure out how to do something, we need to both protect it, leverage it, and then retain that intellectual property, right? So first and foremost, HuLa is very much a closed-loop system. This information is the intellectual property for these companies. So we spent a lot of time protecting that information both externally and internally. But second, once we have somebody on our team that figures something out, we want to share it with the rest of the team so that they stop reinventing the wheel and focus exclusively on answering those unanswered questions. And then last is about retaining intellectual property. One of the biggest challenges in the industry today is that because it's so expert-driven, let's say you are running a research firm and you have a scientist spend 2 years developing a great process and then decide to leave. Well, guess what? All of that knowledge and expertise leaves with him. I mean, granted, on paper, you technically own the intellectual property, but if you don't have anybody in the lab that knows how to do it, it's kind of a who cares. HuLa is solving all of these problems. So who's working on this? I've been living this problem for a little over 3 years. We brought Corey down from Chicago, where he was one of the lead back-end and algorithm systems developers at one of the largest sports statistics companies in the world. And Roosbay is one of the best designers in Central Florida. Backing us up, one of our first customers, Dr. Coffee, is helping us shape what product development looks like. And then Dr. Pete and Mike Judith are getting us access to both funding agencies and labs that we couldn't otherwise touch. So great, looks good, feels good. Is anybody actually using it? Well, we're not quite 30 days into private beta. We have 3 labs on board with more waiting for us. But the really cool metric here is in that time, we've saved them over $10,000. And we're expecting that number to get much, much larger as we have more data pumping through the system. Equally as important is, do the users actually like it, right? Because if the users don't like it, they're not going to put good data into here. And we spent a ton of time working on the user experience. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive thus far. Okay, great. So we have a little bit of traction. Users seem to like it. Who's actually going to pay for it? So our initial target market are these PIs with 5 to 25 researchers. And the reason for that is the pain is most apparent. Most of their funding in these groups is coming in the form of research grants that have finite timelines and finite budgets and very specific deliverables, right? So if these guys fail in the lab, well, guess what? There's no more funding, and everybody goes and gets jobs. So this value proposition of cutting a development cycle in half is resonating very strongly with this group. In terms of a market opportunity, there are 9.4 million research scientists worldwide, specifically in the physical and life sciences space. 2.7 of them are in the United States, representing a $1.8 billion domestic opportunity. When we start looking internationally, these numbers get much, much larger. Great, so how exactly do we plan to add more labs? Well, we broke it into 3 distinct phases, and we're at the beginning of phase 1, and it's all about access and credibility using our university beachheads. Think about this. Scientists are trained skeptics, so they'll never believe what I have to say or a salesperson, but they do believe their colleagues, and they do believe the data. So once we have 2 to 3 labs on board, the acquisition cost for the next 10 to 20 is extremely low. Then phase 2 is all about scale, and where the focus there is in strategic partnerships and integrations. The reason for that, we're going to make HuLa the hub of information for these research scientists. So we'll be partnering with everything from modeling and simulation software products to chemical inventory management and general note-taking to support that. Then phase 3 is really all about how do we add more value to our customers. One quick example here is today, HuLa is able to narrow those possible paths forward from hundreds down to about 10. You start working with one of these big data companies, and that number gets down to less than 5. And that's when things get really exciting. Great, so competitive landscape, who else is working on this, right? Well, by and large, the biggest competitor really is the status quo. It's the paper notebooks and Excel spreadsheets that dominate the market. The digital version of that in the form of electronic lab notebooks have gained quite a bit of traction, and that really rounds out what your user-centric options are. On the other side, we have project management applications and clunky, expensive, obnoxious information management systems that are really great for management, but honestly, it drives users crazy. But what all 4 of these have in common is they keep the information static, right? And why is that important? Well, information is one of those funny things where it's only useful if it's being used, right? So, well, sure, in theory, it makes sense. Let's get all of our good information that our lab produced and put it on a shared cloud so that everybody can get to it, right? Well, in reality, what actually happens, that means that a researcher, when he's building an experiment, has to go and read thousands of other people's experiments to maybe hopefully find something that's relevant to what they're working on. Or with HuLa, they can just go do it and have the right information in line automatically. In terms of a pricing model, we're still testing various structures, but we anticipate settling right around the $69 user month. and how that ends up shaking out in terms of numbers. And apologies, there's sort of a lot going on here. Where I'd really like you to focus is up at the top. And the reason for that, you'll notice by year 5, we're talking about having not quite 1,400 paying labs. There are 50,000 in the United States alone. So we'll just be scraping the surface here. In terms of use of funds, the first 50K is going to be going to hiring a full-time designer to support both product development and additional marketing. The rest of the funds are going to go to customer success, additional development, and then start working on those partnerships and integrations this year. Great, so this is one of my favorite slides, right? Why now? In the world of startups, it's all about timing, right? Well, HuLa is sitting in the middle of a perfect storm in terms of market pressures. From the top down, the funding agencies have actually issued legislation requiring these labs to have some sort of commercialization history. What that means is if you receive research money and you want more, well, you have to show that you've done something with that money in terms of commercialization. In other words, HuLa legislation is set up to drive demand specifically for a product a whole lot like HuLa. That pressure then trickles down to the universities who are competing with other universities for those same research dollars. From the bottom up, the PIs, the buyers, aren't able to ignore the problem anymore, and it's showing up in the numbers. You remember that obnoxious information management system I told you about that nobody likes? That's a $400 million industry and growing. And ELNs are going to catch up to them very quickly. What this is saying is that these labs are desperate for some sort of solution. And then finally, and probably the most overlooked statistic, is the most labs are now primarily populated with post-90s millennials. These are the ones that are demanding better digital products to support the research. And HuLa is sitting right in the middle of it all. So there's very obviously a business opportunity here, right? But what really excites us is not only the opportunity to change science, but to change the world that we live in. Think about this. Every modern technology, from the semiconductor powering your smartphone to modern cancer therapies, all started in a research lab. What we're doing is enabling scientists to bring better technologies to market a whole lot faster and a whole lot cheaper. What that means is better technologies are going to end up in classrooms because it's more affordable. The tens of thousands of people waiting for a clinical trial have a shot. All we need now is your help to get there. Thank you. Oh, and I might bring up, we got some of the other team up here, so I might bring them up for questions if that's all right. Thanks.
Okay. Your background material said you went through the I-Core program.
I did. Well, not technically. We got I-Core money via the Starter Studio program.
Oh, I see. 'Cause I was going to ask, what was your customer discovery process and what did you learn from it?
Customer discovery process. So when we first started talking about it, so I told you we ran into this problem about this time last year, right? So once I realized that there was a bigger problem than just us, I spent probably 4 months doing focus groups and talking to other researchers. And then it wasn't until we brought these guys on that we started building products and doing iterative testing. And so we're still in the process of iterative testing. Does that help?
Nate, but while you're answering
Sure.
Jason's question, can you flip it back to the financial slide?
Can you help me out? I don't have a lot of control. over it.
So one of the things I always worry about in highly complex environments is changing user behavior. So can you describe to me how user behavior changes? So think of the researchers working for the PIs.
Mm-hmm.
How does their behavior change with your system?
Sure. So one of the biggest things, and we spent a lot of time on it, was how do we best match how they're already working, right? And then you have to then put a carrot in front of the users to make them want to use this new system. So today, how they're doing it is effectively building traveler sheets via Excel spreadsheets, lines after lines. And so we've matched that as closely as possible and then put a couple big carrots in front of them. Users spend about 6 hours a week either in meetings or writing status reports. Using HuLa offloads that problem for them. And then the other side of that, it accelerates their process of actually publishing new papers. Does that help? So it's more about how do we closely match what they're already doing and then give them a couple incentives to want to use it.
Right, because the electronic notebook, I mean, the reason that is taken off is because people think notebook. And they,
Yeah.
I'm just, and it has taken
Sure.
off, although the market's not that big yet.
No. No, and what's so interesting is, like, if you'll look back, there's tons and tons of researchers. I mean, the status quo is really still dominating the market, and the LIMS and the ELNs have done a great job of really starting to break down this digital barrier, which honestly is really supporting the timing on us. So.
Nate, nice presentation, but I struggle with, having run a number of engineering organizations over the course of my life, we seem to have been on top of this with archaic ways of doing things, probably, if I go back even 25 years ago. But if I go back just probably a matter of 6 or 7, in a group of engineers in the same organization, I used to be amazed at how well the engineering teams managed this process and managed it well so that they were all aware and sharing information and so forth. But I'm less convinced that in the same organization this problem exists, particularly in the size of smaller organizations that you point out. Larger ones where there might be 1,000 engineers, I could see it. But the thing that bothers me is, why wouldn't you think beyond a single organization? I know my youngest son writes a lot of software for the New York Stock Exchange, and he develops a lot of routines and things that have been developed and invented other places and that are shared in a variety of different places on the internet and so forth, and he finds it relatively easy. In fact, I'm impressed with how fast he can find these things. And so why wouldn't you think beyond just that single organization that you're talking about? I realize it's proprietary information, and I understand there's things you might not want to let out, and there's ways to control that. But why wouldn't you think even beyond that, so your user base is sharing information much more broadly than where you're at?
Really, really glad you brought that up. So one of the things that we took out, just to not muddy this specific presentation, in the beginning of next year, we're going to be rolling out a free student version that would be all public information. I mean, kind of modeling after the whole GitHub concept. And the reason for that is you can start to pipe that information into our paying labs users to add additional value. So when you're talking about not just the individual paying organizations, it's how do we have, so say even if your lab is paying for something, right? Maybe you have some processes that aren't necessarily critical to what your business model is. We'll be able to actually share those and integrate those in the public domain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I get it. Sure. But I wouldn't share it necessarily in just a public domain. I'd share it just amongst my paying customers, if you
Sure.
will. But if you were talking like cancer research labs, there are a lot
Sure.
of them, and they're all doing similar things or different things, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, you're
but
nailing
even
it on the
sharing amongst them, I think that you add a lot more value if I would even get some insight into what another organization
100%.
might be looking at.
So yeah, so how we're handling that, because so you're balancing these two pressures, right, of protecting people's intellectual property and then still getting that altruistic, great, how do we share information and move things forward? So how we're going to end up pursuing that is, say, for example, I mean, I'll take lithographer, for example. You can start to anonymize this information and say, well, hey, compared to your peers, this is sort of the trend in lithography, for example. Does that make sense?
Right.
So then you're still able to sort of accomplish that, but then still protect the scientist's information.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to,
Sure.
is this on? Jason's, there we go. Question, I'm not sure I'm clear what exactly is different about the interface with your system, what the individual's going to have to do differently.
Oh, in terms of just general process?
Yeah, in terms of
Sure.
using it.
Yeah, so now instead of opening Excel and building a recipe, you're opening HuLa and building your recipe.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Well, are you duplicating, are you, in that process, duplicating what you've already done and just digitally inputting it? Or are you able
Yeah,
to
so
combine tasks and?
That's one sort of value add to the user, is you do it once right the first time. I mean, it's all auto-populating, and it helps you build better experiments a whole lot faster, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And while you're doing that, then it's pulling these sort of inline relevant insights that we're talking about.
And my other question is, how far along are you in the development of this product?
Sure, yeah, so no, we've spent a lot of time. I mean, so the company is now not quite 6 months old. We've been in private beta for just less than 30 days. Yeah, no, I mean, we expect to be public and stepping on the gas by middle of May.
And how much money have you raised to date?
I've funded it all.
How much are you looking to raise?
Yeah, so it looks like with 250K, that'll get us to about this time next year, which is really where I want to start kind of stepping on the gas and scaling. So a seed round of 250K would get us to probably March next year. Then we would probably do a $2 or $3 million raise to really start to crank hard.
So you mentioned that if you won this competition, you were going to hire a full-time programmer?
No, a full-time designer, right?
Designer.
So everything is all about how do we, like, couple of things, right? So marketing's big, but it's one of the big value adds that we're providing to these guys is effectively lab health metrics. How are you doing every week based on how you did last week, et cetera? So we need designers for that. We need designers to continue to do development, to work directly with Roosbay. So yeah, it's all about product stuff.
So, and I assume these guys are programming the current.
Oh yeah, 100%. They're the smart ones here.
So, okay, so you're hiring a designer to help kind of shape the development.
Well, that and branding and development and exactly what we're showing off to customers. Yeah.
Okay, so can you explain, how you project getting into 1,400 labs in 5 years? I mean, how physically or logistically
100%.
you plan on doing that?
Sure, and so I started to, I think, touch that in that kind of three-phased acquisition strategy. So this year, I mean, we're talking about being at basically 30 paying labs by the end of the year, because it's going to be primarily direct sales. And it's, again, about that kind of access and credibility. We need data. We need users to be able to go and to scale. So next year is going to shift much more to indirect sales, right? So the reason why we're at the price point we are is we found SaaS products that are $10,000 or less can be purchased online. That's just, empirical research has shown that. Otherwise, you need to be above $25,000 to make the numbers make sense. So we're sitting around $10,000. So then when we come to this scaling piece, it's going to be all about indirect sales, driving people to the site and getting them signed up in about 30 seconds.
And how many of those 31 labs in 2016 do you already have identified or signed up?
Oh, so we're at 3 now. We could add 5 next week if we wanted to, but we're really trying to control the onboarding process. Yeah, we expect, like, the first major milestone is 10, what I call 10 happy labs by middle of May. So basically, we're not in a customer problem at the moment. It's more of an execution problem, and so we're trying to execute the product really well. It's like controlling what does the onboarding process look like, how are we going to learn from one lab to the next, et cetera. So that way, when we do really step on the gas and shift to indirect sales, we know what support material we need and all this other stuff.
Who in the lab do you sell to?
The primary investigator. So basically, they're the scientist turned business leader effectively, and that's why I was more talking about, it's like we're initially targeting these 5 to 25 researchers because the pain is apparent, but the more researchers you get, the more that problem exacerbates. And so but you need their data in order to solve that problem.
Just summarize for us here. So what's the exit strategy in 5 years? We invest in the company, and how do we make money? Who buys it? Is there a precedent transaction you guys look at?
Sure. Last question.
Yeah, he did finish 2.5 minutes early though, Carrie, and I was watching the time, so he's good. Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of an exit strategy, obviously it's a SaaS company. You need to raise money. You need to look at some sort of sales piece. I foresee this turning into something where it gets swallowed by one of the design companies, but even more importantly, the IBM has shown a lot of interest in these type of technologies. So that would be a lot of the reason why we start integrating with something like them, because then all of a sudden, hey, here's a product where you can go and, I mean, now suddenly you're in the research space. Does that make sense? Thank you. Thank you, guys.